Hi everybody, welcome to Contemplating the Cosmos. We have a very interesting topic today. We will be discussing direct energy weapons, interesting anomalies about 9/11, and other things that pertain to the fires in the West. These are definitely things that need to be unpacked. With my special guest today, Mental Boost YouTube channel, we're going to unpack some of these deep issues. And thanks everybody again for joining us as we contemplate the cosmos. Hey everybody, this is Charlie from Contemplating the Cosmos and the 4BZ Truth channel. I have Mitch from Mental Boost. Now, I'm guessing everybody knows exactly who this guy is because his channel is so freaking popular, and he's talking about some really interesting stuff, to say the least. And I had to reach out to him and kind of pick his brain a little bit. There's a lot of stuff that he's putting out there, and it seems like he's saying a lot of the things that I'm thinking. And I have a feeling that he has a lot more information in his brain. Maybe you can share it with me and my listeners. But anyways, yeah. And it looks like we have another visitor too.
That's my shop cat, Joe.
Joe. Oh, that's a good name right there. So anyways, yeah, I appreciate you letting me reach out to you. And, you actually mentioned something. Okay, so first of all, your channel, I didn't realize you had like over 900 videos. You've been pretty busy.
Yeah, I've been out on the fringe for a while now. And I actually have another channel where I do woodworking videos in my wood shop, and I've started on YouTube doing that. And the Mental Boost channel was really just kind of a waste of time, like sort of just messing around on the internet, making satire parody videos of Alex Jones infomercials. And I just had like 10 subscribers, and really I just made these videos to make my friend laugh who thought Alex Jones was really funny. And so I did that for a while, but I kind of went into my own rabbit hole with these weird fires around 2017. And that's when I started taking notice of these things, and looking at what the news is putting out. Specifically, it started with this bridge in Atlanta. So, if you're a conspiracy theorist, I have a bridge in Atlanta that I can sell you. And, this really caught my eye, because, I've always been investigating 9/11 since around 2005, 2006.
Yeah, that's about when I started looking into it.
That's pretty much the dawn of YouTube when all that started. So, I could see like certain details that, just flash in front of your eyes in these documentaries and news segments that they put out. But then on YouTube, you can just keep watching it over and over. And, other channels would do slow motion. So, there's a lot more details that could stand out doing that. So, I was really into that for a while, kind of went down the conspiracy rabbit hole with 9/11. And, I've always paid attention to any of the latest developments, that come out with the truth movement, and anything science related. I was always interested in that.
Is that the thing that kind of hooked you in with the 9/11 thing, is the anomalies of like how the free fall dropping buildings and stuff? And
there's so many anomalies, you couldn't really make one video to list them all. And I have like a kind of a personal connection with 9/11. I was actually in New York City on that day. I happened to be there installing cabinets, and I worked in a wood shop, a cabinet shop that was further upstate, but most of our install work was in Manhattan, and we were in Lower Manhattan on that day. And that was crazy, and at that time I was 23 years old, still pretty fresh out of college. I got a degree in material science and engineering with a focus in metals. And so,
by the way, you're in the Midwest, aren't you?
Northeast in Vermont.
Oh, okay, gotcha. For some reason I thought you were saying you were in Central Time, but anyways. So you're actually pretty late. Sorry to appreciate you.
No, I stay up late. I just got done eating dinner actually, so you know sometimes I can really burn the midnight oil here in the wood shop, and it's starting to get cold too, so I'll be burning a lot more of that.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, sorry to derail you there.
That's all right. Yeah, so I was always curious, like, what these professional paid scientists would say, who were, going to investigate 9/11. And, I think that's where my like real trauma started. I mean, just being in the city and being around all that chaos and panic was, I mean, it was bad enough. I mean,
How
that's
far out were you, like from the
our,
center?
our job site was I would say between 11 and 15 blocks away. So it was
Wow,
relatively close.
close. Holy.
And
You
it was so weird. We were in this brownstone apartment, and there was this big widescreen TV with the live news shot, and I could watch what was happening live on TV, and then
Yeah.
just take a couple steps to the right and see the same thing in a window. It was just like it was so surreal. Um, and when those towers came down, I just couldn't believe it. Just the scale of a disaster like that, and nobody had ever expected something like that to happen. So, I think for like 2 years of my life, I just completely shut down like all the news, and I just couldn't absorb any information about it. And when it started coming out on YouTube, I just kind of really got sucked into it.
Yeah.
Um, but there's just so much to talk about with that event and my personal
Oh yeah.
experience with it.
It's a whole nother dynamic for me. I was in Idaho. I'm in Idaho now, but I remember I worked graveyard shift, and I heard on the radio, oh my gosh, this just in. There's an airplane that just hit one of the Trade Center buildings. And anyways, I mean, I was what, 21 or something at that time, and so I mean, a lot has happened since then. It's crazy to think we're almost at 20-year anniversary, but anyways, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, I actually saw the fireball of the first plane impact on the North Tower. So that was like the start of everything right there. And, I was in a location of the city, like right next to the river, and I had to stick my head out the window, to see it above the van. But, I got a pretty good glimpse of it. And then just after that, everything was,
What
was
did you
just
do after?
nuts.
Did you pay attention to what was happening to that, and or did you just go home, or you keep working, or?
Well, I wanted to turn around, but my boss, he just thought it was better just to keep going to the job site, which ended up being the much better decision uh, because pretty soon after that they shut down the bridges, and everything, the whole city shut down, so we would have been stuck on the road. So it was
Yeah,
much better to be at the job site because we were in a safe place at least.
yeah,
Um, and we were listening to the radio, and there was just like this brief window of time where they opened up the city, and so they started letting traffic across the bridge to let emergency vehicles come back and start dealing with that situation. So he heard that on the radio, and then we just immediately got in, packed our stuff up, and just kind of just floored it to get to the George Washington Bridge, and we just made it over. And
wow,
the whole city was dead. I mean, there was just we were just flying through red lights. Uh, Nobody was around, and when we got to the bridge, there was this train of dump trucks, like all these dump trucks. I mean, we were thinking like ambulances, fire trucks, but I think there was one ambulance and about like it must have been 100 dump trucks that were going like super fast, just flying by on the bridge. And later we heard on the radio after we made it across that there was some bomb threat on for the George Washington Bridge, but some a suspicious looking van, and then they shut down the bridge after that. And that just hearing that kind of just like, I mean, that just added another layer to it. because we were in a safe place at the job site, but then it was like, then we just realized, we were, had some kind of, danger with that. That could have gone really bad. But we were lucky to make it out. A lot of people didn't, and they were stuck there in the city.
By that time, did they already did both of the towers come down, or?
Yeah, this was right around when World Trade 7 was coming down, like 5 or 6 p.m.
Okay.
And so I kind of remember hearing about that on the radio too, driving out. Things got kind of foggy there after so many years.
It's always hush hush when it comes to Tower 7, because everybody always focuses on that one as being like the real anomaly. Like, it just freaking dropped out of nowhere. It's like it got hit by I could just be speaking from information that I just don't know the big picture, but it seems to me like there was a little bit of like shrapnel from the other buildings that hit it, and then maybe had a few fires, but it wasn't like near as much damage as the other buildings. But again, I don't know. I mean,
well, it's been like this repeated talking point for many years that you had 2 planes hit 2 buildings, then this third plane, the third building didn't get hit by a plane. So somehow that makes it more of an anomaly in terms of the engineering. The causality of the fire. The plane impact itself, really couldn't have done that much damage. And, really it's the floors below the fire that really are most suspect, in my opinion, because that was, room temperature, and, the whole building was destroyed. And, World Trade Center 7 is still interesting. It's all interesting, and even the buildings 4, 5, 6, and number 3, which was the Marriott Hotel. There's stuff to look at, but on my channel I like to focus on the physical evidence of things, and I come up with theories and ideas based on physical evidence, and that's something that's really helped move my thinking along. And, kind of getting away from the conspiracy mindset a little bit, because I suspect that this event was a lot more complicated than what people, tend to think, just, looking at stuff on the internet, because, I don't think there's any aspect of 9/11 that I wouldn't be familiar with in terms of the conspiracy stuff that's out there.
What's your stance as far as, I mean, if you're willing to let me know that angle. I mean, do you feel like there was some sort of cover-up of some kind, or? Oh,
absolutely. Okay. But I think the motivations behind that are more complicated as well. I mean, here I have a piece of World Trade Center 7 right here. This is sample B, and I don't know if you can really see it. I've made a few videos on it, but I was able to get this from a memorial site that I visited.
Let me see. Hold on. I was just trying to see if I can. I don't even know how to control my own. Anyway, yeah.
You can get a much better picture of it on my other videos, but I actually went on this personal quest. When I encountered this memorial, I mean, I kind of knew that that these things were out there, but I never really thought that it was going to be something that I could get up close and spend time examining. So I took this sample and some other residue. I mean, you go to these sites and sometimes it's just all over the ground, little bits of rust and things fall off, which is kind of a shame, because these things, these amazing pieces of steel are just left outside. And sometimes they coat them with lacquer to preserve them, to keep them from rusting, which doesn't really work. They still corrode, and they're in a state of deterioration. So I thought it would be important to document these things, while they are still, existing in some form. And I actually got to talk to one of the firemen. This installation was right next to the fire department, and there was a couple like old timer experienced people that went through the process of getting the steel, what they had to do. And apparently anybody could get World Trade Center steel. You just had to fill out a bunch of paperwork and get insurance and pay for the transportation. And then they had to hire a crane and get a separate insurance policy for the crane to get it installed. But this particular fireman, I can't remember his name, and I wish I had my camera. This was like, before I had my phone camera, and I just happened to show up at this site randomly because I was visiting a friend and we were just driving by it. So I wasn't really prepared, but these people came out and they wanted to know what I was looking at. I was obviously interested in it, so they wanted to know if I had any questions, and yeah, I had some questions. But they told me that the steel was delivered to them just as it was pulled out of the ground. So, this piece of steel from World Trade 7, which I didn't know that at the time. They didn't know because it was never identified and it was never cleaned. So it was just this, random piece of steel that just showed up, and it was all covered with dust and residue. And they weren't really happy about that because at that time, the health effects of this dust was pretty well established. And, they had a long list of people that they knew had already gotten sick and died. And they didn't want to be exposed to this stuff. They didn't sign up for that. They just wanted to build this memorial. And then they had, an environmental problem to deal with at the same time. So they power washed this thing and then sealed it up with lacquer. And, apparently it was cut in half at some point, and the other half is in Georgia somewhere, which is interesting. There's over probably 1,000 of these sites around the world, and many of which contain World Trade Center steel or some piece of it, some kind of artifact.
I've always heard that that steel was basically just disappeared or something. Like that's just the way that it's conveyed from like conspiracy theorists, like you're saying. It's like it disappeared. They confiscated it so nobody could analyze it or something like that. But
architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are still using that talking point as some evidence of covering up the crime scene. But yet, like, there's so much of this steel, it's like it's overwhelming. And this is from World Trade Center 7.
Yeah.
You just have to do a little bit of research to be able to identify that.
Yeah, I'm not
steel.
going to jump on that bandwagon just saying that. Because I kind of try to eat the meat and spit out the bones as much as I can. I try not to jump on bandwagons when it comes to certain things, but I definitely like to go down rabbit holes that are, taboo, I guess you could say. But
yeah, well, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth has some real systemic issues, and I kind of got sucked into that for a while, thinking that they're doing some kind of public service. But I have a completely different perspective on it now. And I think fundamentally they've mischaracterized the physical evidence to such an extent that it's just completely going to destroy the truth movement at some point. It's going to self-destruct because, the way that they have characterized this evidence, and in particular the molten steel microspheres and these red-gray chips that they found, and they wrote this scientific paper about. I've found those things in some of the samples that I have. I have the World Trade Center dust here, so I was able to find these little microspheres, and it's something else. I mean,
so what is microspheres? Break that down a little bit, because I don't really know enough about how the substances break down. Or like when you were putting that stuff under the microscope on your last couple videos, I couldn't make out anything that you were really putting on there. I could tell it looked interesting, but I couldn't really. I don't have an eye for that, I guess you could say.
Well, the microspheres kind of started this whole conception of high temperatures. Because it was a dominant factor in the dust that was studied by many other scientists. It was just one of the signature components that made up the dust. And
Yeah.
so there wasn't really a very thorough explanation of the source of these microspheres or what created them. You know, if you do welding or torch cutting of steel,
Yeah.
you know, to fabricate the buildings originally, it's going to create microspheres. But these, the ones in the dust seem to be a little bit different, a little bit unique. And so they looked more closely at them, you know, with the scanning electron microscope, and, you know, ran some tests, X-ray tests, to, you know, uncover its content. You know, like what molecules are present, and that's where things kind of got a little bit astray. You know, because they keep saying it's molten iron because there's iron in it, but there's other elements as well. For example, silicon. You know, the silica content is pretty much always there in combination with aluminum and other elements. In fact, there's never like a consistent uh, uh, output of the X-ray diffraction that was done, you know, with all these microspheres. They're all a little bit different. And,
Yeah.
you know, the ones that contain silicon and aluminum together, I mean, that's just a little bit odd.
Can you
So,
identify the elements or the substances, like just based on looking at it, or is there another kind of analysis that's done to determine what those consist of as far as the elements?
well, I'm pretty limited here in my lab. I just have a microscope that goes to 180x, but I can identify the characteristics based on visual appearance.
Mm-hmm.
If it has a silica component, it's going to look kind of vitreous or glass-like.
Gotcha.
And I've and we can actually put a little attachment onto the iPhone, a little microscope clip-on thing, and we can get, you know, somewhere between 50 and 100x just with the phone camera. And we can take that right to the site and look right on the surface of the steel. And that's where I found the spheres for the first time. There's another guy in Illinois who's been working with me to document some of these sites. And apparently Illinois is this hotspot for some really great samples of the installations. And so I actually bought one of these clip-on things and sent it to him, and, you know, just to test it out. And the images that came back just blew me away. But there's all kinds of fibers, like the insulation that was on the steel, sprayed on insulation. Some of it was asbestos. Most of it was actually glass fiber installation with it's in some kind of cement medium. And some of these fibers were actually changing their shape, turning into cylinders and spheres and combinations of those things. And there was different colors of spheres as well. So, I mean, there's really no explanation for this. I mean, you could show it to a scientist, you know, somewhere, and they're not going to be able to explain what this stuff is. You know, they'll just say, oh, well, that's, you know, evidence of high temperature, you know, or something like that. But I wasn't able to find any kind of reference point that would explain, you know, why a glass fiber would turn into a microsphere.
So that temperatures being that high, does that suggest that there's something that's helping fuel the fire, so to speak? I mean, like the thermite or something like that. I mean,
well, the fire in the case of the towers, the fire was sort of isolated to the impact zone, so you only had maybe several floors that had any kind of heat from the flames that were spreading.
Yeah.
But you can identify the steel in its approximate location by measuring the thickness of the steel.
Yeah.
And the spandrel plates, you know, the steel got incrementally lighter as you went up the building. So that if you know, around mid tower, the steel thickness would be around an inch, maybe inch and a half. At the base of the towers, the steel could be up to 6 inches thick, and the steel where the plane impact zones were was around a quarter of an inch thick. So you could identify the approximate location just by measuring the thickness of the various structural members that made up these box columns.
If that's structurally how it was assembled, it seems to me like, I mean, just based on that alone, the integrity of the building was a lot less stable up top, but not on the bottom. The bottom would have been a lot more secure. And obviously, I'm not going to try to throw my little assertions in here, but I mean, it's just hard for me to, and ever since I started researching it, I mean, I kind of jumped on a lot of bandwagons as far as but again, I'm trying to take a step back and learn from you here, because I know
it's hard not to jump on a bandwagon, because there's such limited information that you can actually get that's meaningful. I mean, you can watch 1,000 documentaries about 9/11 that focus on the human impact of what went on, and all these stories of the survivors and the heroes. I mean, it's just been played out so many times. But if you're interested in the engineering and the science aspect, there's really not that much information that you can get unless you get sucked into the conspiracy stuff.
Yeah.
And architects and engineers, and how they look at NIST and the role that NIST played. So it's hard not to get sucked into that information if you're looking for something different. And the only way I was able to break out of that was when I started doing my own research and collecting information, the visual photographs of what was there, and just seeing steel for myself firsthand. It was like meeting the obelisk from 2001 Space Odyssey for me, being able to interact with this steel personally and see it up close. When these firemen were, I was with a friend at the time, and she blurted out that I had a degree in metallurgy. And I was like, oh gosh, they're going to think I'm some conspiracy nut now. But that wasn't the reaction that I got. They had like all these questions about the steel. It really bothered them. They were perplexed and disturbed by it. And
so you weren't an investigator is all. You were just investigating, and you were entertaining all possibilities, right?
I didn't really know what to think of it. I mean, I just arrived there, and then like we were talking with these people, and then they just, they were like, look at this cut, look at this break, and like what could cause that? They just, they had so many questions about it, and I was just like, hey, I need to spend like 3 hours looking at this thing, and I'll get back to you. And I've been there like 2 more times after that with better cameras to get better close-up shots, different times of the day where the lighting can hit it differently. And there is so much interesting things going on, just dimensional changes of the steel that you can measure just with a measuring tape. You don't need like, you don't need $1 million lab to be able to see the anomalies of this thing. The actual plate thickness is changing, as you go, just within a foot. Like things are happening, like there's cuts in the steel that couldn't have been made with the torch. And I try to focus in on these things, but I don't really explain a lot in my video, so it's probably good that you're reaching out to me so that I can explain things to my audience a little bit.
I had no idea that you had this kind of involvement with 9/11. I mean, I'm the guy that removed myself from it, and I didn't even want anything to do with conspiracy theory. I mean, that was what I was before, but then once I saw the people that came forward with some of the information, and like airplanes couldn't have knocked the buildings down and stuff like that, and then I'm like, okay, well, Osama bin Laden was actually like a hired CIA agent or something like that. And it's like, I don't know, there's all these weird anomalies that are just so, I didn't want to take us down that road necessarily, but I definitely am very excited that you have that kind of insider scoop, I guess you could say. So
Yeah, well, I don't have any special connections. It's just curiosity to see it for myself. And I didn't know what I would expect to find. Um, this particular sample that I got was very telling because I was on this personal quest to find the molten steel that was so talked about. And, if the towers came down at the speed that it did so completely, that it could only be a controlled demolition with explosives and incendiaries, then,
Is that your
this would be the sample that would prove that, because it was taken right next to a cut. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's like, a white residue that's on the steel. Um,
yeah.
this is actual, like a piece of slag from a I-beam connection that was welded onto the box column, but it was covered with this white residue. So, that gave an indication of like some sort of order of operation, depending on what this white residue was. And if you look at it in the pictures, and I don't know, maybe I can re-edit this video for you to add some of the pictures that go along with the dialogue so people can see without having to research all the 900 videos I've got on my channel. Um,
Yeah.
But this white residue is actually a very mysterious sort of thing. It's not really a solid. It's made up of very finely ground particles of all different, a lot of different colors, but it's like densely packed onto the surface, um, as well as fibers from insulation. It's just like this. It's kind of just like the whole building is on this piece of steel. So that tells me that this cut had to have happened during or just before the collapse. It wasn't something that was cut on site, because the residue indicates that the whatever process was going on was getting stuck onto the steel, this little that made the cut. So
When you say
but it,
cut, what do you mean? Are you saying that something cut through the steel? But what are you referring to as in cut?
well, it's difficult to tell the cuts that were made during the cleanup, and there's a lot of different types of cuts that are made. Some look just like torch cuts, but it's not obvious, like if it was done like before or after. I mean, all the steel was fragmented. In the case of World Trade Center 7, um, it was, I mean, to come down at that speed. Here's Joe again.
Nature.
It, um, all the steel would have to have been fragmented and cut up, like, to get that near free fall effect. And so, it kind of indicates that a lot of steel cutting was going on, and it's just left to your imagination if that was some sort of incendiary. Um, but there's different kinds of breaks. Um, and, what I was looking for in particular were like cold temperature fractures of steel. If you bend a really thick piece of steel, it's not going to just make a uniform bend. It's, you're going to get buckling and like little tears that are going to happen at the surface. But, it's a pretty dominant feature of this World Trade Center steel that you get these very smooth curves and heavy distortions that just wouldn't happen normally.
Yeah.
And there's not really an explanation for that. So everybody just says like high temperatures force a collapse and just kind of moves on.
You're saying the official story doesn't have an explanation, or they don't explain.
Well, the heavy steel has never really been looked at. NIST, for example, they got paid whatever $20 million to do their study, but they only selected pieces of steel that were suspect of getting hit by the plane or being exposed to the fire, as because they were just trying to come up with some fire initiation collapse explanation rather than what was going on below to continue the destruction. So they largely ignored the heavy columns, and they didn't select any for further study. And I guess you could probably say that maybe it wasn't practical because the steel was so heavy and difficult to move and expensive, but it was never really looked at. And I kind of focus in on these core columns. There was a photo dump that happened, I think last year, it was just the CD from a yard sale that had all these pictures of core columns from the cleanup, and apparently it must have been taken by an iron worker. But it was some amazing pictures, and some of the distortion and that's going on is just off the charts. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. There's columns that are just torn apart at the factory welds, like the box columns. Everything's the core columns are box columns where you have 4 plates welded together, and these seams would just open up, like, and that's just like, it doesn't make any sense, because if you would expect the connections to break first, because it's a much smaller area, if it was going to be some kind of mechanical failure, you wouldn't expect the biggest weld on the column to fail as easily as it did. But supposedly these big heavy core columns were not exposed to high temperatures, so it doesn't really explain the the deformations.
That is interesting.
So
I'm very excited that you were able to share some of this stuff about the 9/11 anomalies. And honestly, I had no idea that you had samples. I mean, this is one of those things where I would love to unpack a lot of this with you if I could. I know that you're probably strapped for time and what you're doing, but I definitely, if you're, for what it's worth, if you ever want to do some more, breaking down some of this stuff on your end of things, like on your videos, I'm more than interested in watching them. And
I've actually tried. I tried making a video earlier this summer. I was going to call it "The Truth of 9/11," and it was just me kind of talking and pacing around, because I actually have a hard time sitting still for an extended period of time. This is actually the first time I've been able to like sit down, because it's probably not going to work with the interview. But I tend to pace around. But I started talking about this stuff, and it went on for like well over an hour, and it just got too technical. And then it was really hot in the shop, so I just I kept sweating, and my face was all greasy, so I just figured I'd remake the video later on. But I've had some interesting developments this year,
for the
especially with the samples that I've had, and discovering the red-gray chips and kind of doing some experiments with those. I actually contacted David Chandler, scientist for 9/11 Truth, because I had this idea, like, to share the stuff that I've been, collecting, these amazing pictures, the mutated glass fibers turning into spheres and becoming metallic, because they turn into spheres, and there's different colors of them, and they actually take on a metallic appearance. There's like all these gradients of different types of spheres and shapes, and so that kind of indicated to me that there's a very complicated process in how these things form. And Stephen Jones, who started the molten iron microsphere sort of hysteria, he discovered hollow spheres and documented those to some extent. And the spheres that I've been seeing are hollow because of how they form. And so that's not really made clear. And the fact that there is a silicon component to them, it often gets overlooked. So I just don't think it's, genuine to say that this is proof of some molten iron from high temperature fires, or some high temperature event like a demolition with explosives. Because, this stuff is on all the steel, and it's on the steel that's down below. So fire from the airplane doesn't really explain it. But in a lot of cases, the primer paint is also still on the steel where these spheres can be documented. And the primer paint is actually a temperature indicator, because if you go over a certain threshold where the steel starts getting red hot, this primer paint is going to just, combust. It's going to disintegrate. And if you get to a point even where the steel starts to lose its strength, the primer paint's going to crackle, because the steel is going to expand on the surface, a lot more than the primer paint, which is essentially a ceramic. And so if you see this mud cracking of primer paint, that gives you an indicator of how hot the temperature got. So it's like a temperature threshold indicator. And, you know, there's areas where this primer paint is still intact, but these weird spheres and things can be seen. And so I don't really remember seeing any mud cracking of primer paint, but there's just, I mean, I've seen primer paint with crystals growing out of them, which makes no sense. You know, I mean, the primer paint is involved with these mineral transformations like everything else. And so
let me ask you a question. I know that, I mean, we could keep talking about this, but I want to know what your thoughts are on like direct energy weapons, like how that corresponds to like what you're actually looking at, your samples. Do you think that has anything to do with what you're looking at?
Well,
I know that
there's kind of like a long history on the internet with directed energy weapons.
Yeah.
And you can't really get around not bringing up Judy Wood and her work and her following. A lot of my audience are Judy Wood followers, and the directed energy weapon is being used to explain some of the anomalies with the California fires. But you know, nobody really knows what that is. I mean, there's some kind of energy anomaly going on. See, I have a problem with it being conceptualized as a weapon. And Judy Wood sort of started this with her, just the way that she used language. She makes up a lot of words. I actually have her book. Somebody sent it to me for a review, so I was going to do kind of like a book review of her book. Where did the towers go? Then I'm going to write the second edition of the book. I'm going to call it, well, this is where they went. It's going to be just pictures of all the weird minerals and stuff that I've been looking at. But you know, she uses the word weapon, and I think it alludes to it being, you know, some type of attack, you know, and then she suggests that we need to study this and figure it out, and maybe use this technology for something that's, you know, not for some evil purpose. But it's really not clear that it's a weapon, and I think that gives people hi Joe. I think that gives people like the sense of fear, you know, that they're getting attacked, and that these, you know, that this technology is going to be used to, you know, enslave humanity or you know, whatever. There's, you know, but it's really not clear. You know, there's definitely some kind of phenomenon going on, and I've studied her work, and in particular John Hutchison too. I mean, I've actually done quite a bit of research into him, and he's kind of like where that started, because he was, you know, supposedly playing around with anti-gravity and using microwaves and electromagnetic waves and Van de Graaff generators and that sort of thing. I don't want to get too far into that, because that's like, you know, it's going to just open up a whole.
Well, you know, for what it's worth, a lot of my listeners and myself are actually very interested in like, you know, like Tesla technology, the things that are, he's hardly even given credit for a lot of the technologies that actually came from him. I mean, AC current and AC motors, and there's just all these things that he discovered. And now there's a theoretical or even conspiratorial group of people that will say that a lot of people just kind of stole his other technologies and used them, like, you know, I don't know. There's all these different things. And to be honest with you, I don't know what your thoughts on any of that is. But
well, John Hutchison was emulating Tesla and his work. And, you know, there's always been like this mysticism around all of that. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't really know a whole lot about the history. I don't know if anybody does really, about, you know, what Tesla was really up to. I mean, he was kind of working on some experiments that, you know, were never, you know, completed or developed.
like the death
and
ray that I
yeah,
heard.
like the earthquake gun and stuff like that. I mean, it kind of sounds like a myth, um, but who really knows? I mean, I think he was developing something with transmitting electricity, with through the earth or something like that. Yeah, I don't really know what to make of it. I mean, it's the physical evidence that I have is so outrageous, and different. Like I can't get over it. Like I mean, I'd be open to any explanation. But as far as proving something with an experiment, I mean, I think that would be a tall order. Um, so there's definitely a lot of work that I need to do to just look at the samples that I have and maybe put the pieces together somehow, just visually. Um, but
Yeah.
you know, directed energy weapons and 9/11 and the California fires. It's kind of just like this, cornucopia of wild imagination and
Yeah.
just. I mean, there's definitely something strange going on.
I grew up in California, and I mean, they've had wildfires ever since I can remember, like every year. They have them here too in Idaho. And now, granted, this year specifically has been like one of the worst years to record. I mean, they say it's global warming, and honestly, I mean, I obviously, maybe nobody's like tending to the, overgrown weeds and stuff all over the area. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it was your video that I watched that like the Native Americans used to, you know, like fight the fire, like cut down the weeds and stuff to avoid fires, or I don't know. But again, so for the listeners that come back and hear the playback on this video, that's the thing that actually drew me into your channel, is that you were showing like footage of the Oregon fires and the California fires. Now you have samples from Paradise, California.
Yes.
How did you get those? Did you actually go there?
Well, no, they were from viewers on my YouTube channel.
Gotcha.
I got a comment or a contact from one of my viewers, and they saw what I was doing with just remixing what was on the news, and other people like who had lost their homes would visit their destroyed homes and kind of document what was there. Quickly, usually. I mean, nobody really focused in on any details that I was interested in. So I had a hard time really just, getting a good viewpoint of, close-ups of the physical evidence. So I got contacted by a guy, I can't remember his name, but he offered to take some better pictures. He had a pretty good camera. So I was like, yeah, take some pictures. I mean, I gave him an indication of like what I'd be looking for, with the materials, what things I was interested in, like the stainless steel. Uh, and then I was like, maybe you could collect some samples too, and see where that goes. So uh, he was very cooperative. Didn't I offered to pay for the shipping of the samples, and he said that he would ship them, and shipping from California isn't cheap. Um, but that's how I got my first sample box. And he visited the car wash in Paradise, and also a school that had burned down, and the playground was showing these melted playground structures. So there was a lot of molten aluminum, and the samples were very interesting. I still haven't even finished that first box.
Yeah.
But then I got contacted by another subscriber who was willing to do some work collecting samples, and I've gotten 2 boxes full of samples from that person, and there's still much more to go through. And I really didn't know what I would expect to find with the samples. I was just kind of interested to see what I could look at up close. I didn't have a microscope at the time. And actually, after I got the samples, I was like, this stuff is really interesting. I should get a microscope. So I did a GoFundMe video,
Yeah.
and I was able to raise, I think, like $500 from my subscriber base.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
But most of which all came from California. I have like around 15,000 subscribers. I would say 90% of that is just from the fires in California. So there's definitely a lot of interest in that on my channel. And when I do 9/11 videos, looking at that evidence, that the videos are always don't get very many views, but I have a small audience that likes the weird stuff I put out there.
No, I've been watching the video you put up so far since I just found you like a week and a half ago now, and it's crazy. Like I'll stumble into these channels and it's like, man, you're talking about something that hardly anybody's talking about, and in fact, I can't think of anyone. And you're saying Judy, those other two people that you'd mentioned, I didn't even know who they were. So.
Well, Judy Wood made some interesting comments about the California fires in an interview with Andrew Johnson. I think this was probably a couple years ago, and she poo-pooed the whole directed energy with the California fires and kind of made fun of the people who were interested in that. I was very surprised, that she would take that sort of position to just not really take other viewpoints into perspective. And meanwhile, I'm looking at some really interesting things that can't be explained, and samples that are like mutated. And in terms of material science, there's a lot of really interesting things. I actually have some samples here. This is a stainless steel bolt.
Yeah.
That has aluminum fused onto it.
Wow.
And if you know anything about welding aluminum, it's really difficult to get molten aluminum to stick to anything because it forms an oxygen barrier very quickly. And, that relationship between aluminum and oxygen is difficult to interrupt. So to weld aluminum, you have to use some special equipment or do it in a vacuum. You have to do it in some kind of noble gas where it can displace the oxygen.
Is it possible that the fires were just roaring so much that it just consumed all the oxygen in the surrounding area? Possibly, I don't know.
Well, that would be possible if you had some form of containment, but if all the oxygen is used up, that's going to depreciate how bad the fire can actually get. So it's not going to. And what's interesting about passive layers, the passive layer is the oxygen barrier that prevents things from sticking. Is that that passivity actually increases with increasing temperature because the oxygen starts to get more aggressive and it wants to stick to the aluminum even more. Mm-hmm. And this is actually some molten glass or broken glass, but it has little bits of molten aluminum stuck on it. I did one on the microscope on this one. You probably can't see this sample, but there's this area where the glass is fused to the aluminum so strongly that it is like a layer of it stuck on there, and it looks very interesting. But it tells me that the bond between the aluminum and the glass is stronger than the aluminum with the oxygen, which, in terms of what we know about the materials, that doesn't really make any sense.
Wow,
so the aluminum has just kind of gone haywire. And what role the oxygen is playing there, is kind of a mystery. And another thing that I discovered recently is the carbon. There's a piece of charcoal with minerals and stuff fused onto that. So, I don't know where that's going to lead. But it suggests that the minerals are playing some kind of role with the carbon. Maybe that could be a way to explain, how things are burning, like supercharged.
Yeah.
you know, because, you know, I always thought that maybe the fires are just kind of like this medium for this other sort of process to take place that, you know, is interfering with metals in some way. You know, I think about this late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep. You know, it's like, um, you know, but it's just like kind of exercise for my brain. Um, but before the Paradise Fire, there were a couple other interesting fires. Um, 2017 was a very interesting year, uh, and the bridge in Atlanta that started it, that kind of caught my interest. But then you had Grenfell Tower, which wasn't really even much news in this country, but it's still pretty much ongoing there. Um, I don't even want to bring that up because it's like a whole topic, and I want to get back into those videos. But
Yeah.
in 2017, we had the Tubbs Fire, and this was a very interesting event in Santa Rosa, and it was the first time we had seen the widespread urban conflagration, where, you know, you have, you know, houses that are kind of in the rural woodsy areas, uh, and those are more susceptible to, you know, getting damaged, getting affected by the fires. And previous fires that had occurred throughout California's history had shown that, you know, people can get stuck up in the mountains during these wildfires. It can be, you know, it can be a bad situation. But in the Tubbs Fire, we had this breach of the wildland urban interface, or whatever they call it, and started burning into the subdivision. And so it wasn't really a forest fire, even though that's what they were calling it. It was like this, you know, house to house fire that was just out of control. And, you know, there's just some crazy things happening there. You know, cars were being like picked up and flown, flipped upside down. Like cars were being just like all like distorted. Like it's not even, didn't even look like a burned out car. It was just like, you know, part of the chassis and the motor would be all like crumpled up. Um, just some very strange things going on there. And the government's response was interesting, because it was the first time this had really happened with, you know, in a densely populated area. And you know, people were allowed back the next day, because there was like, it was like there was no really any authority that knew how to handle this situation. With the fires that they have now, they shut down the areas for at least several days. You know, they do the search and rescue, search for bodies. You know, make sure the fires are out. But in 2017 Tubbs Fire, like people were just like meandering around, and you know, were allowed back into their homes, and that provided some interesting footage because people recorded that while, you know, some fires were actually still going on. And Santa Rosa had a natural gas system, and something went haywire with the natural gas. And, you know, there were news reports that they had to dig up the main lines to, you know, shut off the gas because all the valves weren't working or something.
Yeah.
And so it's like something was going on underground. You know, and there were just these really interesting cases, like, you know, like a news reporter would be doing a broadcast, and like a fire would start inside the house behind them, like inside the house, like just kind of all this spontaneous combustion going on.
Yeah.
You know, it just doesn't make sense. And, you know, the physics of how fire spreads, you know, what we know about it doesn't really explain that. And the news kept repeating this, you know, with the embers and the wind. You know, it just takes one ember to land on a house, you know, and it just goes up into flames.
I've done a lot of camping. I have a bonfire in a pit, and it's not easy to start a fire. You have to have a lot of heat, obviously, to get something like a house to start burning. And man, because it's not like I mean, houses over here, there's a lot of siding and stuff, but stucco houses in California, those don't
Yeah.
work.
Terracotta roofs and stucco, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of cement board products that are used now, and some pretty strict building codes as far as I
Oh
can
yeah.
hear. And the thing is that, like, science tells us that they solved this urban conflagration problem already, like since the 60s. There was a really bad wildfire in the early 60s. And at that time, there weren't really any building codes. Like, a lot of these, areas were chartered in the 50s. And the common building practice was to use the cedar shake, because that was kind of like an indigenous material, traditional home building method. But then when you start packing in the homes with cedar shake siding and roofing, uh, the embers can really be a problem. I mean, you're covering your house with basically kindling.
Yeah.
And so, they had a really bad, Santa Ana wind fire event that's common. And, houses were catching other houses on fire, and they couldn't put them out fast enough. And so, the embers could get carried, a couple miles. And, that was well documented. So that was something that happened with an urban conflagration, and a lot of the building codes, were developed out of that disaster. And so the cedar shake was banned as a material, and so you'd seldomly see a house with that now. And but that's what science did. It improved all of that. So now we're seeing something like that repeat itself, but with all the modern engineering that's in place. It kind of creates a lot of conflict. And so, I was interested in that. And of all the news reports that I've reviewed, I try to do as many as I can to see what, how the media reacts, and
Yeah.
what the government's response to things are. And only one time in all of the news reports from all these fires from 2017 till now, the building codes ever get mentioned. And it was one, I think, in the Thomas fire, which happened after the Santa Rosa fire, where somebody working for the media asked Governor Brown about the possibility of improving building codes or reviewing them to make improvements to prevent this embers catching houses on fire. And and Governor Brown just brushed it off and went right back into climate change. And since then, it's just never been addressed. It's never been talked about. So I look at it. I look at these California fires as like this huge engineering disaster, because, like, all the fire codes, all that material science that goes into making structures resistant to igniting in a brush fire event, it's just not working.
I grew up in a construction home. My dad was a general contractor in California, and I know a little bit about construction just based on my exposure. And those codes over in California were pretty strict. So it's hard for me to believe that, they would let something like that slip. It's crazy.
Yeah, what's interesting is Coffee Park is this area of the subdivision that burned through in the Tubbs fire.
Mm-hmm.
And it completely decimated this area. Like, there wasn't a single standing house, I don't think, and there were a lot of flipped upside down cars and weird things that were going on. And when they started rebuilding Coffee Park a year later, I was shocked to see that it was all like wood structures, as if there was like no alteration at all in how these structures are going to be rebuilt in an area that was completely razed by fire.
Mm-hmm.
In the UK, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on passive safety. So, there's limitations on how much wood and combustible materials that you can put into a structure, because in London they have a long history of fire events and disasters. So they're very strict on passive safety. In our country, where we weigh more heavily on active safety systems, fire alarms and sprinklers and that kind of thing, which kind of gets into Grenfell Tower, which was basically a concrete block that was covered with a cladding that supposedly was combustible, but I don't want to get into that right now. But yeah, it was interesting to see, these wood structures go up in Coffee Park, and really no revision to the building codes or discussion of that. The only result is that, like, insurance companies just started dropping people. Like,
Yeah.
a lot of people in California probably just don't even have insurance now, because it's not even they had an option to pay more money. They're just like, insurance companies just want to pull out of there.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting response, because normally, like, you would see some kind of science, some type of engineering solution put on the table. It's like, how do you build a fireproof house? I mean, that's the job of a scientist, to come up with something like that. What kind of materials do we need to put into buildings so that people can feel safe in their homes and not have to worry about these fires raising towns to piles of ash.
It's interesting. There's a guy that passed away probably, I don't know, 15 years ago now. But my dad and I we're going to start trying to take this product that he was developing, or he actually developed it. It was called Thermal Block. And we actually, after he passed, he was going to give my dad the rights to his patent. And just because he didn't have any kids that wanted to take on that responsibility to expand the product. But anyways, we called it thermal light concrete. Anyways, the point is, it was made with pumice and ash within the mixture, and it made it virtually like indestructible to fire. and during that time, that was right after the 9/11 attack. Yeah, anyways, the point is, it had something like that been in the structure, it seems like that would have helped avoid a catastrophe. But I mean, I have a little bit of background in that, which is interesting that we're talking about this.
Just using metal studs instead of wood framing would be a pretty standard, like, improvement. In areas like Greece, they don't do wood frame structures. Greece had a really bad wildfire a couple years ago. They're mostly concrete block, and just the trusses of the roof would be framed in wood. So it's like, there's a lot of things that just don't make sense with the building materials, and the ignition and the speed at which these houses burn to the ground. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's one video where an outdoor game camera caught a house in the background from the start to the finish, and I timed it. It was like 13 minutes from the time it started to catch on fire to, like, the whole thing was on the ground, collapsed. And it's just like, that's really just a product of the wind. It's like, it doesn't make sense, because, like, you could have any windy day and a random fire starting, and then technically that could start the urban conflagration, but we only see it coincide with the wildfire events. And that's something that's kind of perplexing. It's like, if these houses are so combustible and they burn so quickly and easily and catch other houses on fire, why don't we see that happening, like, all the time? It's like, we only see them during these event fires, and it's perplexing.
By the way, this hat right here says "dryer on fire." My side business. I do fire prevention maintenance for like dryer cleanouts and vent cleaning and things like that. So I'm interested in the fires just because I know that things happen. But anyways, it's interesting that I mean, I find myself kind of preaching to people a little bit about, like, the fire prevention. Anyways, that's beside the point. I just thought,
hey, I can do a marketing plug here too. I have a side business. I sell rubber feet. These are my products. I'm a rubber feet salesman.
Oh, okay.
And here's I actually got some new colors that came in, some exciting lime green colors.
Interesting.
I don't know if you can see it. It's cuttingboardfeet.com. This is just a menu of, like, all the different sizes that I sell. I've been doing this for a few years. And these are 100% silicone, so you can put them on top of your toaster oven, and they will not burn or melt or combust. So they have a high temperature resistance.
Yeah.
So we can make that appropriate for our conversation.
Yeah, there you go.
I got to compete with Alex Jones too, you know.
Yeah, you're not crazy and eccentric enough. You have to get you have to start screaming and like banging the tables. Anyway, he's entertaining to the point of like he's a psycho, but I can appreciate some of the stuff he says, I guess. But yeah, so I mean, and again, I appreciate you educating me on a lot of this stuff because I honestly, the common or the layman, the common folk out there have no clue. They're just kind of going with the flow. The media is saying things that don't make sense. I think they're just trying to, tell people what makes them feel good or something. I don't know. Or, the thing about global warming, it's like, it sounds like propaganda to me. Like they're trying to, like blame people for what the fires, you know what I'm saying? See, look what you did with the global warming or something like that.
Yeah, I have a theory about why we hear about climate change so much as the explanation. And I think it kind of chimes in with the insurance conflicts that are happening and the level of responsibility that governments can handle for this. Because, once you start bringing up building codes, you're going to start to question the urban planning and like how these towns were laid out. I mean, is it safe to build structures that close together? And then we see them, burn so quickly. That creates a long list of liabilities that I think is hard for governments to really manage. Yeah. And so, we can make scientifically defensible arguments with climate change being an influencing factor, but that's pretty much the limit of what science can tell us. And I think it takes a lot of the liabilities away, and it steers the conversation away from building codes and, bringing that whole aspect of it into question. And just, towns don't really need to consider, changing, how their towns, I mean, how many fire trucks you need. I mean, is it, it's like, once you start telling people that their houses aren't safe, what are you going to do with all of the towns that are built the same way? Like with 9/11 and the skyscrapers, once you bring, the engineering aspects into the conversation, you're going to bring up like, well, are skyscrapers around the world even safe? It just opens up more and more conflict. And, the building trades don't want to go there. Insurance companies.
So I'm sorry. You reminded me of like other buildings that have burned in the past that never collapsed. Like I'm trying to think of the countries. There was another country where there was like in Brazil or something. I forget. But I remember hearing like about this fire that started like burning like, I don't know, 3 or 4, 5 different stories where they were just completely consumed, but the building never fell. And
I did a video on a skyscraper in Brazil. I think it was Sao Paulo.
Yeah, I think that's the one that I was thinking of.
But this building caught on fire and it did collapse like completely into its own footprint, and it looked like World Trade Center 7 debris.
Oh, okay.
It was like, when I saw that in the news, I was like absolutely floored, and it looked weird. I mean, it was a concrete structure, steel reinforced concrete, and it had a fire like in the center of it, but like the whole thing just came down at free fall. And I was like thinking like conspiracy theorists are going to go nuts about this one, or the debunking that goes on is going to go nuts, but nobody really paid attention to that one. Mm-hmm. I'll send you a link to the videos that I made about that, because I just thought it was an interesting example that juxtaposes the whole, free fall, speed, collapse with fire. It's just an interesting example. It just kind of like contradicts everything. It contradicts all of the arguments, really.
I mean, I'm committed to truth. I want to go where the evidence leads, and I'm not just going to dismiss something that doesn't jive with my point of view or my perspective. Um, so, if there is a scientific explanation for a building that collapses after a couple floors start on fire, I mean, there's got to be an explanation for it. But there's just something fishy about the 9/11 Commission. How it was kind of like only a few people were involved in that, it seemed like, and they were very hush hush about a lot of the stuff. Or is it just me looking at the wrong sources? You were saying that there's information out there that, as long as you know where to look.
Yeah, well, 9/11 was never really investigated because, the core columns were never part of that investigation. And, the weird particles that were found in the dust. See, a lot of the weird particles, and this was one of the biggest discoveries that I've made here in my dilapidated woodshop in Vermont, is that there is a connection between these unusual particles in the dust that had been discovered by USGS and other scientists who were studying the asbestos. See, most of the scientists who were paid were evaluating the environmental impact of this dust. And so they had to figure out, like, what are the toxic factors, and a lot of that concentrated on the asbestos. But what they found is that the asbestos itself had chemically changed. It was impinged by sulfur and other elements, and this was one of the fingerprints of the World Trade Center dust. The asbestos from that dust from that event was different than just regular asbestos, which contradicts what we know about asbestos being a very durable and chemically resistant mineral. And that's why it's used as a fireproofing insulation. And so, the fact that so many signature components were found in the dust that were unique to that event, is really telling. But none of those dots have ever been connected as far as like what could, change the molecular blueprint of these materials and get them to combine in ways they wouldn't normally combine. And and that's one of the things, like, when Stephen Jones and then later with the red-gray chips, they did the X-ray, differential analysis where they figure out what chemicals, what elements are present, and there wasn't really a consistency there. Lead was detected in some of them. There's a whole laundry list of different chemicals, different elements that would show up, and that doesn't really build a strong case for it being a manufactured material, because if it was something made in a lab, you'd expect some level of consistency. But all of these materials were different, and so that's just, to me, I interpret that as, well, it must be part of some kind of exotic process, where you have like this wide variation based on the exposure of these materials and what they went through to get that way. It made all of the X-ray analysis kind of irrelevant, because it just, like they did the same thing with some of the molten slag from some of these supposed cut members, and they found fluorine in the steel and all these other elements that don't normally show up as an alloying element. NIST actually found nickel as attacking the steel in some of the samples that they looked at. Like this one particular truss rod was all eroded away, and so they looked at the corrosion that was on there, and they found nickel forming with the iron and precipitating inside the grains of the metal. And nickel is not part of the alloy. That particular structural steel alloy did not contain nickel. So it's a question of, well, where did this nickel come from, and how did it get into the steel? They write it off as just, well, it happened after the fact, as the steel was, exposed to these highly corrosive conditions, burning in the pile for months. But that's just kind of speculation,
Yeah.
They just never really investigated that. Nobody investigated the fires at Ground Zero and what was really burning and why that persisted for so long. And I think the energetic materials like the red gray chips could actually help explain that, but the nature of how those red chips got there was not really investigated. See, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth make this wild speculation that was, the physical evidence made in a secret military lab, with advanced technology. But when you look at the red gray chips in conjunction with all these other strange particles, like, lead zinc glass fibers, from USGS, and all kinds of these, weird things that I've been seeing with the spheres mutating and, the glass fibers, it's, to me, it just looks like another weird mineral, that's part of this, crazy transformation that went on. But by saying that it's, proof of thermite being found, I think that's a pretty far-reaching speculation at best. And I question why they're so persistent in, in maintaining that narrative. And that's one of the reasons why I contacted David Chandler. I brought this up earlier, but I showed him some of the pictures of the red gray chips that I had found and gave him my perspective that, as part of some, different kind of process. And so I was thinking about it differently. And I got an interesting response.
Yeah.
Because I was like really blown away by these pictures. I have some good photographs. And I plan on making a video of this email that transpired between me and him. Because I couldn't get a reaction out of him. He definitely looked at all my pictures and actually shared them with Stephen Jones as well. It's on my Google Drive, so I can see pictures of them as they show up and interact with my photos. But when I pressured him to comment, because I kind of lost patience, I was like, I think this stuff is amazing. It's inspiring to me just to see how different it is. And he just wouldn't comment on it. And he even went so far as saying that I was being abusive, by challenging him. And he actually blocked me. I've been blocked by the 9/11 Truth movement, for my independent research. So, if that's an indication of like where they're at as far as like either their scientific acumen or like, are they part of some type of cover up to push a narrative, making these conspiracies and steering people away from the real evidence? I don't really know. I mean, I'm no stranger to conspiracy theories, but I can't figure out like how they can get things so wrong and stick with it for so long. But I don't know. I'm kind of like more of an artist than a scientist. I mean, I went to school, but I just couldn't handle it. Like I like to do things creatively, like explore things on my own. So I don't know if it's like my observational skills being kind of, with the work I do with furniture making and being able to conceptualize things, more fluidly, that I can see, the patterns that are different, the things that kind of stand out to me. I mean, I went to college as an undergrad, and I had some PhD teachers that were terrible at communication, and really not very good at creative thinking at all. But they're PhDs, I mean, you just go to school and you spend a lot of money and time and do the protocols, and you can get a degree. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to solve difficult problems that are outside the box. So, I don't know. I mean, I think the work that I've done, so far can speak for itself. It's open to interpretation. I don't really have any answers to like what could create these things. And certainly with the evidence from California that I have, I never expected it to be that weird and different. Like, like here's my glass sponge. This is one of my favorite samples. You probably can't see much of it in the bag, but like, it's such a complicated material, and it's it's also a hybrid mineral. You know, like the glass and the carbon are forming together and creating its own structure. Like,
Yeah.
you know, it's like how does thermodynamics, you know, of a fire explain that? You know, it's interesting. The guy that collected the sample and sent it to me thought it was molten aluminum. You know, because when you have molten metal hitting the ground, the moisture can evaporate and create air pockets and make it like a hollow shell, and that's what he thought that this was. And I had no idea what it was until I could see the transparency of it under the microscope. That it was like, you know, had a structure that
It was
was
glass.
obviously silicate based. You know, there was some kind of mineral that contained silica. So, you know, I just kind of meander around here. I never get bored in my wood shop unless I'm doing some kind of woodworking job. I can always look into my samples and discover something new. And you know,
Wow.
that's made my life a lot more interesting.
Well, it sounds very, I mean, all the stuff you're doing sounds really interesting. I mean, I kind of wonder, I mean, it sounds to me like you kind of just go and research and you try not to draw conclusions. I mean, that's kind of what I'm getting from you. And I don't really know if you have a position on like the 9/11 thing. I mean, would you say that you think that there's something behind what we're seeing on the surface or the mainstream narrative? Do you think that there was, you know, a couple airplanes that hit the towers and that was that, you know, or was there kind of a cover up behind, you know, I mean, is any of this stuff related as far as the fires are concerned, or maybe is it just that we don't understand science? Like there's, you know, like just the way that fire or heat, thermodynamics, the things that happen under really high heat conditions, do we fully understand that? I'm starting to realize that there's a lot of things that we don't understand about our reality. And, you know, maybe, I mean, have you drawn any conclusions about these things?
Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I think it's important to note that in terms of people in government and people working in the news media probably don't have a very strong background in science. Maybe just, you know, the nuts and bolts that, you know, people go through in high school. But, you know, I mean, there's only a small handful of politicians that make up the government body, and chances are they're not going to come from a background of professional engineering and science.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably some exceptions. Jimmy Carter was one exception. He was a nuclear engineer before he became president. But other than that, there's not really a lot of proficiency that I see. It's just not the skill set that makes a good politician be a good politician, if, you know, there is such a thing. But, you know, I mean, to really get good and proficient at science takes years. You know, and it's more than just book smarts. I mean, you need some kind of experience with it. You know, so it's my perspective that, you know, the government probably doesn't really know a whole lot in terms of, like, you know, the theoretical science that might exist beyond what the limitations of science are. I mean, we don't really pay professional scientists to investigate anomalies. It's just not the way money works. You got to pay a scientist. I mean, they need to get paid like any other professional. But you know, it was like, where would that money come from? And like, what if they don't know? I mean, it's just, you don't pay a scientist to just show up and be like, oh, I just don't know. You know, you want some kind of result. So, and in many cases, the anomalies just get kind of ignored. They don't really get investigated. And so, you know, with 9/11 and things like that, I mean, if you can compare 9/11 with the California fires in the scope of just the scale of the disaster and the trauma, the amount of loss, the infrastructure that's damaged, I mean, it's really kind of off the charts, you know. And I think if you're going to prioritize something, it's going to be, you know, how are you going to rebuild these cities? How are you going to restore confidence of the public and the governments to to lead. You know, I mean, it's the government's job to tell people that they're safe. I mean, that's like number one priority. Even if the people aren't safe or there's some question about that, it's going to be somebody's job to smile and tell you everything's okay. It's just kind of how our dysfunctional world works. It's a complicated thing. So, you know, I think there's a big discrepancy in like how people see the world actually working, and you know how it actually works. I think there's a whole lot more chaos out there that people can really grapple with. So I kind of getting lost in my own thought process here, but
Yeah.
you know, it's like how would the government know that it's lying about science? I mean, how would it know that it's putting out a false narrative when all the real scientists like are just kind of running away scared from the issue? You know, they don't really have an explanation for the distortion of the steel. You know, they're not really able to make connections between the corrosion and the way the steel is bending. And I theorize about that all the time. In fact, when I saw the steel, I was conceptualizing that there's some kind of impurity getting into the steel, which is causing it to bend that way. Because at cold temperatures, the steel just wouldn't bend that way. You know, so something has to be changing the microstructure of the steel and penetrating in there. And you know, there is evidence to support that. But you know, how are you going to get the government to frame that, you know, for public consumption? You know, it's just like it's a difficult issue, and I'm not trying to be apologetic for like the way our media works and how the government puts out information. You know, it's difficult to say. I wouldn't know how to manage a situation like that. I sometimes think if I was like some level of authority, like how I would handle 9/11. You know, would I tell people like the way it is? And it's a difficult problem. You know, a lot of times our politicians look and sound really dumb. You know, like Trump, he's always putting out these tweets that just make people so mad.
Yeah.
But you know, it's just it's hard to speculate like what they really know and how the world really goes out there. I don't think the world runs on conspiracies to cover up crimes. I think it's more like avoiding liabilities, controlling public perception in order to manage very difficult and complicated situations. Like with 9/11, you know, if you're into conspiracy theories, you probably don't know much about the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey and the role that they played. And in fact, a lot of the steel evidence that I've been talking about and looking at these memorials came from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They actually saved the steel. And meanwhile, everybody thought that all the steel was recycled, sent to China. World Trade Center 7 steel was quickly, shipped away, destroyed. But the Port Authority actually saved it, quite a bit of it. And nobody knew about this. Nobody knew where it was. It just kind of showed up in like 2012, 2014, after, all the NIST reports came out and things kind of blew over. Then all of a sudden, all this World Trade Center steel just appeared, and it was in the news. And
News, I don't recall ever hearing about it.
well, I didn't recall hearing about it either until I started researching it. There is, unless you were like listening to the local news in any one particular location, it wouldn't have been on like the big news channels. But, it was a big deal for the local towns and the fire departments that signed up for it to be able to get the steel and build their memorials. And there's some really bad art at some of these memorials. Oftentimes a sculptor or some artist is brought in to, use the steel in some way. So they build like structures on top of the steel. It just looks goofy to me. But, people are trying to connect to the event in some way. There's no rule book in how you do that. So I connect with it in a way, in my own way that satisfies my curiosity. But the Port Authority, they're the engineers that built the towers. It's their engineering that came down, and but they've completely been off the radar. All the focus has been on NIST, and accusing NIST, criticizing what they did or didn't do. But the Port Authority was actually at the scrapyard selecting the steel as well as NIST. But NIST was only looking for the light steel that was fire affected, so that they could kind of wrap this thing up. And but the Port Authority was collecting some very interesting specimens, and so some of the heavy steel was actually collected by the Port Authority, and it's almost like they were going to do their own investigation with it, but it never happened. It just got put in a storage locker somewhere, and then until it blew over, like nobody knew anything about it. I just think that's interesting. I mean, it just kind of shows like how much we just don't know, how much information is concealed, and like the roles that like these top level authorities and engineers, like I mean, what are they really thinking? I mean, the Port Authority was in an incredible position to assume liability for their failure, being that it killed so many people and created an unprecedented environmental disaster. But at the same time, they provide a critical service to the city. I mean, they manage and build all the bridges, the tunnels, and the ports. For the city to lose the Port Authority or to have it crippled with lawsuits would just add to the disaster. So I can kind of see how they would manage that to keep them out of the limelight and let them kind of do what they needed to do. Maybe they saved the steel because they were worried that they might get sued. Maybe they were going to try to make a case that the steel doesn't make any sense. So how could you sue somebody unless you could make a sense that there was some problem with the engineering? But I think the stuff that I've seen, I mean, it's just every site that I've been to is just showing these amazing effects. So it's just important to note that the specimens that NIST selected for their kind of doctored cover-up sort of report, were not as interesting as the ones that the Port Authority selected. I mean, if I was going to select the interesting pieces, like I probably would have picked the same ones that they did. This is really interesting. There's actually a couple samples that have wood lodged into the steel, like a wedge that was used to align the steel to like get the bolt holes to line up the right way. Mm-hmm. There's part of the wood wedge still existing in the steel assembly. Like all the concrete is blown away, like all the steel is kind of distorted and columns are cut like a lot of the other ones, and then you got this piece of wood sticking out. I mean, it's there's another one with a piece of plastic, like a PVC plastic, which is a very low melt temperature material. It's like all like crammed into this area that is like this pocket that has all this debris. I actually have a sample of part of this debris.
There's like still, but then there's wood that's just lodged into this. Oh my gosh, it's just crazy.
Yeah, there's plenty of evidence for low temperatures or a temperature threshold that was never reached that was even enough to crackle the primer paint, let alone melt PVC plastic conduit. So it's definitely an anomaly. I mean, there's no way around it. It's just I don't have an explanation for these things. I just think that they're interesting. But to make the case that high temperature is the only way to explain this, I think it's a far-reaching sort of guess that isn't really supported by the physical evidence. But being that there's no other way to explain it, it's the best guess that we have, and that's why controlled demolition with thermite is still like the dominant model that people accept, at least the people who are curious about it and skeptical of the official story. I don't think anybody believes the official story. I think it's just a convenient way to wrap it up and fill out the insurance paperwork
I just
and
wish that
move on.
a proper investigation, because it really set people on this wild goose chase for all these different things that become conspiracy. Like, I mean, that was really the thing that set me off as far as like trying to understand and research everything else. Is like my filter of belief stems from that, I guess you could say. And again, I try not to have belief when it comes to a lot of analysis, because really belief really hinders true analysis. And it's really just going where the evidence leads that you can truly find, the true outcome of something. So, like, I can appreciate the perspective that you're approaching it from. And again, I find myself, as you're talking, like, biting my tongue, thinking like, okay, like I kind of think that this video is going to get shadow banned by YouTube because we're talking about it. And, those are the kind of things that I'm thinking about, because I've had 9 videos deleted by YouTube because they don't like the content that I'm talking about. And yeah, YouTube's a private company, but I feel like they're all about promoting the mainstream narrative, and it's like I don't know. I want people to know the truth, and that's kind of why I do what I do. And I don't know if you feel like you've gotten closer to the truth, or if you feel like you just are like, it's so convoluted now you don't even know how to make any sense of it or something like
Well,
that.
I've definitely gotten closer to YouTube. I actually had my channel taken down for a brief time. I had this multiple copyright strikes come in,
Oh, okay.
and some of them were kind of suspect. Like really, like,
Yeah.
some of my 9/11 videos got taken down for violent and graphic content, and I'm just looking at, like, the collapse mechanism of the building coming down. Like, I don't know how they can interpret that, to be violent and graphic, but it's a sensitive event. I mean, it's hard to speculate from the perspective. I mean, YouTube has their own lawyers look at this stuff, and it's suspect. It's susceptible to human error. Certainly. I mean, I think every YouTuber has kind of like their qualms with how their community guidelines works. And I made a video about the dancing Israelis. I probably shouldn't mention that, because that'll like put this whole video in a different category, but it's one of the things that they're sensitive about. Even if you bring it up with some level of constructive criticism, it's just it's difficult. So I think my advice is just to try to make the purpose of what you're posting clear, so that they understand, like, be as descriptive as you can, like as if you're talking to one of the lawyers on YouTube, as opposed to just, your audience. And, I don't think they're trying to crack down on free speech. I mean, I've never felt like I was being censored. Like,
I believe that they are, like, fully. I mean, I'll let you finish your point, but I put things up that actual doctors, because you said that, like, politicians are not scientists. They shouldn't be the ones making the call on certain things as far as science is concerned. But I don't think YouTube are doctors. The people behind YouTube, they're censoring certain things that doctors are saying about medical type stuff. So you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, free speech, we'd like to think of it as being free, but people can get hurt with information. There's a lot of bad information going around. I mean, if this is in reference to the coronavirus, I would definitely regard that as a sensitive issue.
Yes.
And I definitely have, my own skeptical thoughts about that, with vaccines, with, how we're going to, enforce whatever plan they come up with to, make this manageable. It's just going to be one big mess. You know, there's so many people who are skeptical of any information that comes out that, you know, any solution, even if it would be a good one, like it probably wouldn't work just because people aren't going to follow it. And if enough people don't follow it, then, you know, in terms of it being a contagious disease, like how are you going to manage that? It's really a difficult problem. So I can kind of understand why they would clamp down on information, you know, even if it's just, you know, suspect. You know, I would never recommend that you should trust your doctor blindly. I mean, doctors get caught up in their own, you know, egos. You know, it's just difficult. You know, I mean, if you go to any doctor, they'll give you a diagnosis, but they won't tell you, they won't even ask you, like, what are you eating? What are you putting in your body? Like, what kind of things are you exposing yourself to? They just treat the symptoms.
Yeah, rarely.
You know, they follow a protocol, and there's a lot of misdiagnosis that goes on. And, you know, but at the same time, they're liable for things. So it's like, it's just one big mess.
Yeah, it seems like more often than not, people are covering their butt. That's just, you know, they're operating from covering their butt. You know, like I work for a large employer. My day job, I do manufacturing for like aerospace and military and stuff like that. We do control board manufacturing, basically, and you know, we're helping build the infrastructure of communication that's out there. And again, the type of person that I am, I'm thinking like, okay, I'm helping build the mass surveillance system that, you know, they're going to be controlling everybody with or whatever. And forgive me for just always, you know, I don't want to come across like this is just my knee-jerk feeling on everything that I think about. But I do feel like, you know, we are really changing directions in this world right now, like when it comes to the new world order type thing and whatever. So there's the trigger word, new world order.
Yeah, it's the oldest trick in the book, right?
Anyway,
old world order. Well, you know, I'd like to just add that, you know, the whole world is full of mystery. You can pick and choose which mystery you want to get into. I mean, it doesn't have to be, you know, 9/11 or, you know, materials anomalies with California fires. I mean, you can do these tours to visit the, you know, megalithic structures around the world. I like to look at these videos when I'm kind of taking a break from, you know, doing mental boost news remixes and whatnot, and woodworking stuff. Like I find it's fascinating. They discover these things like all the time. There's always new ones.
Have you seen the channel Bright Insight?
It doesn't ring a bell.
He talks a lot about the archaeological anomalies, you know, things that aren't consistent with the mainstream view. He has like over 1 million subscribers, and I'm going to be meeting with him. He lives in Boise, Idaho. So
cool.
Yeah, I'm excited for when he actually puts out his next video, because he said when he's done with that, like, we're going to go have coffee. So
I follow Brian Forster. He does
that guy.
He does the hidden Inca tours, and so he all he does is visit these sites, you know, around the world, and he takes pretty good footage, you know, drone footage. He has his own theories about what he's looking at, but I don't think anybody has these things figured out. Like, you know, the size of these megalithic stones, how precisely they're cut and fit together, and like why they're built. You know, and archaeologists obviously get it wrong. You know, they just come up with their best guess that it was, you know, copper tools and stone pounders.
Man,
you know, but you know, it defies logic. I mean, there's no evidence of tooling, advanced tooling that could make these things. You know, engineers nowadays, you know, would struggle with that level of precision.
Nope.
You know, but there's a big question of like, why did these things exist? How old are they?
Yeah, I know that people insert stuff like that, anti-gravity. I mean, there's technologies that a lot of people are assuming that the ancient people had some sort of information or technology that we're not privy to now. But I mean, yeah, our cranes can't even move like the medium-sized stones that they were moving around. Like for hundreds of miles, they were moving stones around, and I don't know, crazy stuff. I mean, this is a topic I love. I love this topic.
Yeah, there's a bunch of YouTube channels that just study these things. There's iron pillars in India that have some kind of unique alloy that doesn't rust, something to do with phosphorus, being part of the alloy, which isn't really typical of a modern alloy. But, there's like ancient metallurgy, that we don't really know that much about.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to add, we did some magnet tests on some of the sites that we went to with the compass, and I got the inspiration watching Brian Forster do this with some of these megaliths because they have magnetic properties that make the compass go haywire when this is kind of a recent discovery, uh, and there's no explanation for this, but it just adds to the curiosity of like, what these stones really are, because you don't really see that effect in a naturally occurring stone. So, it kind of suggests that the microstructure of some of these stones may have been altered in some way artificially so that it has, unusual localized magnetic properties. So I was like, hey, maybe my guy in Illinois, I said, if you have a compass, just go to one of these sites and see if it shows any kind of different reading. And in fact, the compass goes haywire on some of these big heavy columns. So the World Trade Center steel has magnetic anomalies, like these megalith structures that have been discovered to have magnetic anomalies. So, put those two things together, I mean, it's like no wonder the scientists freak out.
Yeah.
But that's just something I discovered randomly. It was just an intuitive thought to do that kind of testing.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So anyways, I think our video has run on for almost a couple hours now.
I usually go for 2 hours, so I apologize. I probably should have warned you in advance. But we could wrap it up here, and I appreciate sharing all this stuff, and I actually I mean, I don't really have much to add to that without starting another conversation. So I don't know if there's any closing thoughts that you want to say before we get going, or
well, I don't know. I mean, directed energy weapon just pops into my head again, so maybe I could just mention that. Like, okay. If we conceptualize all of these anomalies as a weapon, I think it's going to hinder the creativity that may be required, and the abstract thinking that may be required for us to collectively think outside the box and problem solve.
Yeah.
The potential source, energy phenomena that could be creating these things. If we think of it as a weapon, we're going to think we're under attack, and we're going to respond in a way that our primitive brains kind of evolved to respond to a threat. And we're gonna blame politicians and accuse one another. I mean, if I don't subscribe to any particular perspective, and I'm kind of like on the fringe by myself, then I could be susceptible to being accused of being some insider, or having some part of the deception that's out there. But I'm just encouraging other people to think creatively and problem solve this issue. But it's unfortunate that things like 9/11 and the California fires have such a high social impact, where it's just the devastation just cripples society. And I think that's one of the things that makes it difficult to study, because it's more than just a scientific curiosity. It's an environmental disaster. It's a mental health disaster. And we need our government to function in a way to manage those aspects, to keep the world moving on, keep people shopping and taking care of their families and their jobs. You know, I've known a lot of people who go down the conspiracy rabbit hole with 9/11, and you know, it can affect your marriage. It can get you fired from your job. You know, it can, you know, because you want to talk about these things. You know, you want to inform other people, and sometimes that can, you know, conflict, you know, with what your employer wants. You
Yeah.
know, it can, you know, I have more or less free reign to think and talk about these things because I'm self-employed. But you know, if I was part of the government or part of, you know, some corporation or an educational institution, you know, it might put things into conflict. I don't know. I mean, I would like to think that I'm doing something constructive, but you know,
It's good.
the world is complicated. You know, things are under pressure, and people often don't know how to react, and so things can come out awkwardly. And sometimes people can be in the line of fire when things, you know, get confusing. You
Well,
know,
I think we need to have more people like you doing research and unraveling the mysteries. I mean, I don't think that we should put you know, all the power in the hands of the government and the mainstream. I think that there should be people out there trying to figure things out. Even though I'm not qualified to do that necessarily, but I do like to search for patterns, and patterns, you know, kind of piecing the puzzle together. And because I feel like I'm intelligent enough to figure certain things out. So, and you know, and I was intelligent enough to see that your work and what you're doing is an important aspect of research, and I think that you should continue to do what you're doing. So, uh,
well, I really like the name of your show, Contemplating the Cosmos. I was like, you know, that's I gotta contribute to that.
I don't know, like some of the content I get into, you might like poo-poo or think I'm psycho, or I don't know, you whatever. I mean, I'm willing to address any topic, and I don't care what it is, especially if it's something that's contentious, because I like to draw my own conclusions, I guess you could say.
Well,
Um,
if you're talking about the flat Earth movement, like I have a lot of flat earthers on my channel, and you know, I try not to create an environment of shame and humiliation, you know, by interjecting my own opinions and perspectives. Um, you know, I think a lot of the flat earthers, just for an example, are highly intelligent, but there's all different kinds of intelligence, you know, and, you know, our physical bodies and minds have evolved, you know, over the course of eons, you know, to have some kind of advantage for survival. And, you know, I think a lot of people in the flat earth community are very creative, abstract thinkers and highly intelligent and able to communicate and form groups. And, you know, but as far as like forensic science, you know, and, you know, producing, you know, evidence based theories that kind of hold up to scrutiny, they, you know, they might struggle with that. But there's all different types of intelligence out there, and you know, you can't really say that one is better than the other. It's just different. Like with Judy Wood, for example, I would say that she's a highly intelligent abstract thinker. And you know, the book that she wrote has some very interesting information, but it contains a lot of poems and things that you don't normally see, like science going in that direction. You know, it's like clearly she's having some type of personal exploration into this event, and her book is a reflection of her personal experiences and, you know, how she developed her thinking. You know, so with 9/11, it's important to be able to think, you know, outside the box and kind of,
yeah.
you know, you know, leave science, like what we know about science, like you know, outside. But you know, I'm probably going to get a lot of comments just bringing up her, you know, her book.
Yeah.
I plan on making more videos about that. There, you know, there's this one page where she mentions crop circles, and I was very interested in this. I've always been fascinated by crop circles, and nobody even talks about these things anymore. It's like, you know, so 1990s, you know, but you know, and the media doesn't report on these things either. But you know, in 1996, like there was like this media frenzy over crop circles. Like every time a new one would come out, it would make headline news. Um, and it's it's kind of strange how it just diffused into just being this, everyday phenomena now that just isn't even newsworthy. When these things continue to happen and become more complicated. You mentioned being able to find the patterns. Well, these patterns themselves are so complicated. Like, and then when you add in like the mechanism, which I discovered by actually following a link that she mentioned in her book that showed that there's a mechanism of iron oxide forming in some type of mineral formation on the stalks. I never knew that before, but it was just like an experiment that was done in the 1990s, like really old school stuff. Um, so there's a lot of connections to be made, like the nature of these iron formations on the stalks. I thought they were just heated up and just bent over, but it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that. And I think there's a lot of things that are going to be quite a bit more complicated than we give it credit for. So, I don't know. Maybe we should just leave it there.
Yeah, we can definitely keep going with this. Yeah, so the crop circles thing, I'm wanting to do more investigation. If you haven't heard of the documentary Fall of the Cabal, which is just some random documentary that I ran across on YouTube, and I thought it was like 3 hours long. I mean, it's like a huge investment in time. But the lady that actually developed the documentary, she started into her research with crop circles, and I thought that was interesting. But if you ever look that up, I mean, it talks a lot about like the governmental and big business and all kinds of different stuff. There's a huge conspiracy stuff right there. But I'll leave my stuff at that. And if you're interested in, like, once I get this video cut, I mean, you don't have to share this on your channel, but I guess I'm giving you the option if you want to. I'm sure a lot of your listeners probably want to know what's going through your mind, and you shared a lot of what was going through your mind on this interview. So I thought it was awesome. And we're a minute over 2 hours, and I appreciate your time, man. Mitch, it was a pleasure, sir. And I'll let you get going if you want.
All right. Well, we can pick it up again some other time.
All right.
I think I will share it on my channel just to see what comes out. And, I think it would be informative, for my audience who've been wanting me to do more of the talking type things, but it's hard for me to just talk to myself. I get wrapped up in my own thoughts, so it's easier to have a conversation than to just do a dissertation. So
it's good. And if any of my listeners hear Mitch's perspective, go to Mental Boost, subscribe to his channel, like this video, make sure we can get the word out on that. But anyways, yeah, thanks, Mitch. Appreciate it, man.
All
right. Thanks, Mitch. Have a good night. All right.
You too. Bye.
Talk to you later. Bye.
This is wild. So what is going on here? So was it exposed to some electromagnetic waves? Or is it like this because at some point these blocks underwent or came in contact with something strange? I mean, this whole place is bizarre.
But wisdom demands, too, that we take time to understand this force. Because here, in fact, is the answer to a dream as old as man himself. A giant of limitless power.
There's something really cool about this one. It's in the complete opposite direction. And here, even more so. So was it exposed to some electromagnetic waves? Or is it like this because at some point these blocks underwent or came in contact with something strange? I mean, this whole place is bizarre. This is wild. So what is going on here? This is wild. So what is going on here? This is wild. So what is